These are 8 extremely rich black comedians who live like they're poor, and the list gets more and more ridiculous as we move. You will see a woman who rewears a $4,000 dress and still hunts for Groupon deals. But that's nothing next to a man who quietly paid the rent for 160 strangers. And at number 1, we have a comedian who turned down $50 million and instead bought a tractor. Let's dive in. Number 8. Tiffany Haddish. We're kicking it off with a woman standing on a red carpet in a $4,000 white Alexander McQueen dress, surrounded by photographers wearing the exact same dress she wore the last time, and the time before that. But guess what? She is doing it entirely on purpose. Because in Hollywood, there is one rule about red carpet fashion that nobody ever breaks, and it's that you wear a garment once and then it disappears forever into a stylist's van. Tiffany Haddish looked at that rule, worked out roughly how much money it was costing everybody, and decided she would rather keep the dress and keep the $4,000. And if that made things awkward for the fashion press, then the fashion press could get over it. And before we go any further, I need you to understand something about comedy money, because most people have no idea how big it actually gets. A single Netflix special can pay a top comedian more than a starring role in a studio film. An arena tour can print money for a year straight, and unlike an actor, a comedian doesn't split it with a cast, a director, and a studio. It is the most quietly lucrative job in entertainment, and almost nobody realizes it, because the whole point of a comedian is that they walk out on stage looking like a guy who just got off a bus. Which means the 8 people on this list are sitting on far more money than you would ever guess from looking at them. And that is entirely deliberate. And once you start pulling on that thread, the whole picture unravels beautifully. She drives a Honda HR-V, which is a perfectly nice hybrid crossover and also a car you would not look at twice in a supermarket parking lot. She uses Groupon. Not ironically, not as a bit, but actually for dinners and for activities, the way your aunt uses Groupon. She has been open about carrying a fake Michael Kors purse around town, while her real Givenchy and her real Fendi, both of which were gifts from colleagues rather than things she paid for, sit safely at home where nobody can spill anything on them. Now, you can only really understand this if you know where she came from, because Haddish grew up in foster care, and there were stretches of her early comedy career where she was homeless, doing stand-up while living out of a car. Then Girls Trip landed in 2017, made over $140 million worldwide, and turned her into a genuine movie star basically overnight. And she is now worth somewhere in the region of $4 to $6 million. But the woman who slept in a car does not unlearn that in a decade. She has said flat out that she expects to be cheap with her money for a very long time, and honestly, given what she survived on the way up, who is going to argue with her? And she'll tell you all of it loudly, on any podcast that'll have her. Because with Haddish, the thrift is part of the act. Which makes it genuinely strange to find out there's a woman in Florida who has been running the exact same playbook for 25 years and has never once put a word of it in a set. Number 7. Summer. Before Summer was Summer, she was Lorianne Rambo, and she was studying business administration at Morris Brown College, which turns out to be the single most important fact about her entire career. Because here is a thing that almost nobody outside the industry understands about comedy. The comedians who get rich are very rarely the ones who get famous. Fame comes from the specials and the sitcom deals, but the money, the real money, comes from ownership, and most comedians never learn the difference until it's far too late to matter. So Moore learned it first. She hosted BET's Comic View, which at the time was the single most important launchpad in black comedy, and made careers out of people who walked in with nothing. Then she became a headline act on the Queens of Comedy, a tour that broke records, grossed millions, and proved to a doubting industry that 4 black women could fill a room as reliably as anybody else on the circuit. And that would have been the moment to cash out. Sign with a network, take the guaranteed check, hand over the material, and let somebody else own it forever. That is the trade almost everyone takes, because the number in front of you is always bigger than the number you're giving away. Summer didn't take it. She went and produced her own specials instead, which means she kept them, which means the back end is hers and it stays hers. Speaking of the discipline it takes to turn down a guaranteed payday and bet on yourself, a lot of it comes down to how the brain performs when it matters. That's the idea behind an audio series called The Genius Switch. It's based on the neuroscience of the flow state, that mode where focus and creativity click at the same time. and the whole routine is just listening with headphones a few minutes a day. It's a one-time $39, less than a single online course, and it's backed by a 90-day money-back guarantee, so you can test it on yourself with nothing to lose. If you're watching on your TV, pause and scan the QR code on screen with your phone camera, or tap the first link in the description. Now, back to how Summer treats every dollar that stayed hers. And she runs her personal finances exactly the way she runs her business, which is with a deep and permanent suspicion of anything shiny. She's openly wary of free gifts, because in this industry, a free gift is almost never free. She won't chase fashion trends, preferring classic pieces that will still work in 10 years, and she put her money into a quiet, low-risk home in Plantation, Florida, rather than a Hollywood Hills statement piece that would need a staff of 4 just to keep the pool clean. She never made frugality part of the act. She just quietly kept doing it for 25 years while flashier people came and went around her, which is what a quarter century of receipts eventually buys you, which is calm. So what does that same discipline look like in somebody who hasn't earned it yet? Someone only a few years into real money, already one of the hardest working comedians in America, and absolutely terrified of every dollar of it? Number 6. Josh Johnson. Josh Johnson has a line about being broke that I have not been able to shake since I first heard it. He says that being broke is like drowning in a swimming pool, because once you're already completely soaked, a little more water doesn't really register. And it's not really a joke, it's a description of how his brain works. If you have been that far underwater already, then a bad month doesn't frighten you the way it frightens a man who has never once been wet, and that is the strange advantage he carries around with him. That's the mindset he brought out of a low-income childhood and straight into one of the most demanding careers in American media. He writes for The Daily Show, he appears on it as a correspondent, and on top of a full-time television job and a national touring schedule, he released a brand new stand-up set on YouTube every single week for 156 consecutive weeks. That's 3 years without a break, writing fresh material every 7 days and then giving it away for nothing, which is a workload that would break most working comedians, and which he apparently just decided to do. And you would think a man generating that much work at that pace would treat his bank account like a reward, but he does the opposite. Johnson is almost clinically obsessed with avoiding what economists call lifestyle creep, which is the slow, invisible process where your spending rises to swallow every raise you'll ever get. He treats his earnings as a safety net rather than a scoreboard, and the spending simply never goes up. Then there's the part that genuinely surprised me. Over the last few years, every young person with money and an internet connection has been dragged into some kind of speculative gamble, whether that's crypto or NFTs, or piling into whatever AI company just went public. Johnson skipped all of it. Completely. Not $1. For a man who grew up with nothing, the appeal of a lottery ticket should be enormous. He knows exactly why it isn't, and that's the whole point. Restraint like that is easy enough to admire from a distance. It gets considerably funnier when a multimillionaire is standing on a street corner in Chicago, waiting for a total stranger to walk over and hand him the keys to a Prius. Number 5. Hannibal Buress. Hannibal Buress rents his cars from strangers on the internet. Not a limousine service. Not a leased Range Rover sitting in a garage waiting for him. He opens Turo, which is essentially Airbnb for somebody's actual vehicle, and he books a Toyota Prius from a regular person in whatever city he happens to be in, and then he drives his family to the zoo in it. A working comedian with a multi-million-dollar net worth, folding himself into a rented hybrid that smells faintly of the last guy's air freshener, because it costs almost nothing and it does the job. And this is a man with every excuse to behave otherwise. He wrote for Saturday Night Live and for 30 Rock. He was one of the best things about Broad City. He was extraordinary on the Eric Andre Show. He's been in Spider-Man, and his stand-up specials have built him a serious and durable fortune. But he has a real and unconcealed contempt for the machinery of celebrity, and the entourage in particular, which is worth stopping on for a second because almost nobody thinks about it properly. An entourage looks like friendship. It is presented as friendship, and it is often built out of people who genuinely were your friends. But the moment you're paying for their flights, and their hotels, and their nights out, it stops being friendship and quietly becomes a payroll. And now you have 5 people whose rent depends on you staying famous. You cannot take a year off. You cannot turn down the bad job. You have handed away the exact freedom the money was supposed to buy you, and you did it while feeling generous. Burrus worked that out early and simply refused to build one. So he keeps his overhead almost comically low, his real estate practical rather than performative, and his life small enough that he can still walk into a room without a production budget attached to him. And he does all of it from a place of total calm. It's a calculation, he's run the numbers, he's happy with the answer. That is not true of everybody here. One man on this list lives in almost exactly the same way, and he does it because he is quietly, permanently frightened. Number 4. Roy Wood Jr. Long before The Daily Show, long before he stood up at the White House Correspondents' Dinner in 2023 and roasted the most powerful people in the country to their faces, Roy Wood Jr. was sleeping in Greyhound bus stations between gigs, working out whether he could afford to eat that day. He grinded through the American South for years like that, and when the money finally arrived, it did not fix him. It just gave him something new to be scared of losing. He has a name for it, and it's a good one. He calls it workplace paranoia, which is the low, permanent hum of a man who is convinced this could all be taken away from him on a Tuesday without warning, for reasons that will never be explained. And rather than fight that feeling, he uses it. It sits on his shoulder every time he considers buying something stupid, and it wins every single time. But the roots go back further than the bus stations, all the way to his father, Roy Wood Sr., who was a civil rights journalist and, in his son's telling, the coupon king of Birmingham, a man who would go genuinely out of his way to save a few cents on a gallon of milk. That is what Roy Wood Jr. grew up watching, and you don't shake it off just because Comedy Central started calling. So there are no luxury cars, no trophy real estate. The overhead stays flat no matter what the paycheck does, and the money he does put to work goes into his community, into youth baseball, into tutoring programs, into the kind of thing that never once ends up in a magazine. His father taught him how to hold on to a dollar, and he has held on to every one of them since. Somebody else on this list got his lesson from his grandmother. It arrived far too late, and it cost him 160 rent checks in a single month. Number 3. Michael Che. Michael Che grew up in public housing on Manhattan's Lower East Side, and he now co-anchors Weekend Update on Saturday Night Live, which is one of the best paid and most visible jobs in American late-night television. He has held it for a decade. And by every rule of the genre, this is the point where the Bentley shows up. Late-night money is generational money, and the standard playbook says you buy something absurd, you put it on Instagram, and you let everyone know you made it out. Che didn't buy anything. And then in 2020, we found out exactly where his money had been going. His grandmother died of COVID-19 that year. She had lived in the same New York City Housing Authority building for more than 30 years. And in the middle of a pandemic that was destroying working people financially, Che could not stop thinking about the neighbors she'd left behind, all still facing a rent bill that was not going to wait for anybody's grief. So he paid it. Not her apartment. The whole building. 1 month's rent for all 160 apartments, quietly, in her memory, and he did not put out a press release about it. Sit with the arithmetic of that for a second, because it is not a small gesture, it is an enormous one, and he made it without a single luxury purchase to his name that anyone can point to. The man who could have bought the nicest car in New York instead bought 160 families 30 days where nobody knocked on the door. That is what he thinks money is for. And there is nothing modest about that at all. Che emptied his own bank account for a building full of strangers. Meanwhile, 30 years earlier and one borough over, another comedian was working out a theory about buildings that explains, more or less perfectly, every terrible movie you have ever watched a comedian make. Number 2. Chris Rock. In 1994, Chris Rock bought a historic carriage house in Clinton Hill, Brooklyn for $370,000. Then he did the single least glamorous thing available to a rising comedy star, which is that he rented it out to tenants and collected the money for decades. This is a man worth somewhere between $70 and $80 million. 4 decades in the business. Saturday Night Live. Then Bring the Pain in 1996, which is still one of the greatest hours of stand-up anybody has ever recorded. Then Madagascar, then Everybody Hates Chris, then sold out arenas across the entire planet. And his primary residence is a quiet house in Alpine, New Jersey, where he has lived for over 20 years, because he saw no compelling reason to move. Rock's entire financial philosophy fits into one sentence, and he says it better than I could. Live below your means, he says, and you can turn things down all the time. That's it. That's the whole system. And it is far more radical than it sounds. Every dollar you don't spend is a project you don't have to say yes to, and a room you don't have to sit in, and a note you don't have to take from an executive who has never been funny once in his life. Comedians are not usually destroyed by failure. They are destroyed by success that got too expensive to maintain, and then by the compromises they made to keep paying for it. And he has watched it destroy people. Rock will tell you, without much sympathy, that the moment a comedian buys himself a $6 million house, you can start the countdown to the bad movies, because the house has to be fed and the mortgage does not care about your artistic integrity. He is openly contemptuous of the peer pressure in show business, the guys with 4 cars they never drive, and a security detail protecting them from a public that mostly just wants a selfie. He kept his overhead low. In exchange, he got to keep saying no. And that single sentence is the entire philosophy of this video, compressed down to its bones. Only one man ever took it further. He took it about as far as a human being can physically take it, and he did it in one afternoon, over a phone call, for $50 million. Number 1. Dave Chappelle. In 2005, at the absolute peak of Chappelle's show, Dave Chappelle was offered a contract extension worth a reported $50 million. He said no and left. He walked out on the most successful show on the network, on the biggest cultural moment any comedian had generated in a decade, on more money than most people can properly conceive of, and he went home to a farm in Yellow Springs, Ohio. Not a compound, not an estate with a name and a gatehouse, a farm, in a small town of a few thousand people where he could be left alone. And the reason he chose Yellow Springs is worth knowing, because it isn't random. His father taught at Antioch University there, so he'd spent summers in the place as a kid, and the town itself has a real history to it, having been a stop on the Underground Railroad and a stronghold of civil rights and anti-war organizing for generations. He didn't retreat to nowhere. He retreated to somewhere that already meant something to him. He is now worth somewhere between $80 and $100 million, and he drives a tractor. Think about what that actually means, because it's a different order of thing entirely. Every other person on this list refused to spend their money, which is difficult and admirable, and takes real discipline over a very long time. Chappelle refused to take it. He looked at $50 million, and instead of counting it, he priced it. He worked out exactly what it was going to cost him in ownership, in creative control, in the ability to walk out of his own front door without a plan, and he decided the number wasn't high enough to be worth what he'd be handing over. And the industry, predictably, could not process this at all. The story that went around was that he'd lost his mind, because within the logic of Hollywood, there is genuinely no other explanation available for a man turning down that kind of money. The idea that he'd simply done the maths and didn't like the answer was not a theory anybody was willing to entertain. And because his overhead was almost nothing, he could actually afford to make that choice. That is the entire lesson of this video, delivered by a man on a tractor in Ohio. He spends his money on the town instead, running low-key shows at the Yellow Springs Firehouse and the Wirrig Pavilion, playing to a few hundred neighbors in a place where nobody's trying to sell him anything. He didn't live like he was poor because he had no other option. He lived like that so he could pick up the phone, hear a $50 million offer, and hang it up. And those were 8 extremely rich black comedians living like they're broke. But look at what they all actually bought with it, because none of them were saving for the sake of saving. Haddish bought security after a childhood that had none. Che bought 160 families a month of peace. Rock and Chappelle bought the same thing, which is the right to say no, and in comedy that is the only currency that has ever really mattered. So which one got you? The $4,000 dress worn 3 times, the man renting a Prius from a stranger, or the guy who turned down $50 million and went home to Ohio? Drop it in the comments, hit that like button if any of this surprised you, and subscribe to Black Status, because we break down the mindset of the ultra-wealthy every single week.